All right. Okay. So now I'd like to call Dr. Sofia to present on the topic relational environmental ethics, a shift of mindset for safeguarding and restoring natural ecosystem. So Sofia, an environmental ethics expert from the University of Naples, Federico II, Italy, and a research fellow for the 7th edition of Global Environmental Outlook. Her research focuses on the ethical aspect of social and environmental crises, as well as on the human-nature relationship and biocultural diversity. So, Sophia, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you to Adenike for the invitation. Thank you all for the insightful presentation before me. So unlike other presenters, I'm not an environmental scientist, but I have a background in philosophy, and I have a PhD in environmental ethics. And so I'd like to try to contribute to the discussion in this World Environment Day on land restoration with a theoretical framework on what we can do to change our mindsets and step up our policies with environmental ethics, with insights from environmental ethics. So first of all, I'd like to share with you another definition of land degradation, which has already been presented. This one comes from the IPBES Land Degradation and Restoration Assessment published in 2018. And they define land degradation as the many processes that drive the decline or loss in biodiversity, ecosystem functions, or services, and includes the degradation of all terrestrial ecosystems, including associated aquatic ecosystems that are impacted by land degradation. And on the other hand, we have restoration, which is defined here as the intentional activities that initiate or accelerate the recovery of an ecosystem from a degraded state. And we have active and passive restoration. Active restoration includes several human interventions that want to influence and accelerate natural successional processes to recover biodiversity, ecosystem services provision. The idea here is to try to analyze what are the, let's say, ideological processes that underpin these definitions. And in some cases, we know that restoration, which is obviously a very important process, a very helpful process to help reduce degradation, is underpinned by an idea that is bringing back an ecosystem to an original state, an alleged original state, which doesn't recognize any human footprint. So the idea that humans are not part of the natural ecosystems and they have to be excluded from it in order for it to be functional. But we have to remind ourselves, as literature shows, that we have shaped the Earth for at least 12,000 years, so at least since the agricultural revolution. This map shows that from 10,000 years ago to now, the biggest difference is not the extent of human land use change, because 10,000 years ago we had already changed much of the Earth's surface, but the biggest difference is landscape use intensity. So what has changed in this millennia is the fact that we have impacted more deeply the earth, and not more extensively, not in quantity, but in quality. And the idea is that land degradation is mainly a feature of modern ways of engaging with the natural environment. Since the Industrial Revolution, we have increasingly degraded the natural environment, but the land use change processes were already there. So land degradation is not an inevitable outcome of human activities, and we can have different ways of interacting with the natural environment. And so I'd like to share with you some examples of positive interactions between humans and the natural environment. One comes from my country, actually. I've worked mainly in rural, remote areas in the inland areas of Italy, and I've found, and these findings are confirmed by an editorial that was published in Science in 2023, that abandonment of a territory by human activities is not necessarily positive for biodiversity. It's obviously positive when the land that is abandoned was managed intensively and with croplands poor in biodiversity. In that case, passive and active restoration have very positive effects, and biodiversity and ecosystem functions increase. But when the interesting thing is when the abandonment occurs in cultural landscapes or socio-ecological systems that co-evolved for millennia or centuries with human activities, the effect of the abandonment can be mixed or even negative. So the idea is that in those cases, human activities are an integral part of the ecosystem processes, and excluding them abruptly from the ecosystem can lead even to the loss of biodiversity. And another example is obviously indigenous people and local communities. Indigenous peoples in particular constitute about 5% of the world population, but they account for, they care for more or less 22% of the Earth's surface. And in these 22%, they protect a staggering 80% of the remaining biodiversity. So they obviously have a direct positive effect on stewardship of nature. And so they can help in land restoration practices. And they also have an indirect effect, which is by safeguarding the traditional local knowledges about the ecological systems in which they live and that they safeguard. And the idea then is that during the course of our species history, there have been many ways of interacting with nature. Different cultures and populations have explored different ways of, let's say, being humans. So of interacting with local environment. And these ways have not necessarily been negative, disruptive towards the natural environment. And we can learn that some of these alternative ways can be complemented to current policies. And we also have to remind that the ideologies underlying some of the current ecological science knowledge and even conservation practices are imbued even unconsciously with a Western worldview that is filled with the idea of dualism and separations between humans and nature. So what we can do is find a new conceptual framework that can inform science and policymaking. And I think that a very interesting approach is the relational one that is already being institutionalized by several organisms at the international level. One very interesting concept in this area is the concept of relational values. Relational values have been defined as values that do not directly emanate from nature, but are a derivative of our relationships with it and our responsibilities towards it. So it's defined as, let's say, a third form between intrinsic and instrumental values. Intrinsic values being the values of nature in itself, why we should protect nature in itself and not in its own right. And instrumental values are the ones that we attach to nature because we take something from it. And this concept of relational values has been operationalized by IPBS once again. For those who don't know, I didn't mention before, IPBS is like a mirror organization for the IPCC, but it's an intergovernmental panel, but it's focused on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And in 2022, they published this very interesting report that assesses the diverse values and valuations of nature that people assign to nature. They are very diverse, very complex. They even proposed a typology of values that several populations in several countries with different cultures and cultural backgrounds assigned to nature, from the most anthropocentric to the less anthropocentric one. Some populations want to take advantage of nature for their own, for meeting their own needs. Some other don't even have a notion of nature as something separate from, the human community, and they live as nature. So the idea is that from a theoretical perspective, the relational approach suggests to focus not on the entities per se that are involved in the relation, but on the relationship in itself. And this allows us to gain a more comprehensive and complex picture, recognizing the different needs and different interests that are at stake and that can be contrary to one another. The idea is that the interacting with the natural world can be different across different populations, across different needs. And we have the possibility to focus on relational values and to implement them in our policy design. And by including relational values in our policy design, we can put ourselves in this circlet here that is at the confluence of instrumental, intrinsic, and relational values in order to recognize the differences of the several stakeholders that are not necessarily only humans, right? And not only the present humans, but future generation, non-human entities, and even entire ecosystem. And as the IPBS itself states, by including the diversity of values and even the relational values that we attach to nature, this can inform better policies, more complex policies, more comprehensive ones that are a prerequisite for building the just and sustainable future that we all desire. So I'll close here my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Sofia. Thank you, Sofia, for a very nice presentation. So actually, the topic, the relational environmental ethics, is completely new to me. Thank you for introducing this topic. It's really good. So I'd like to, before jump into the discussion, so I'd like to ask you a few questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience as well. So first, how can a shift in mindset contribute to more effective environmental policies, and can you provide examples of how relational ethics have been applied in ecosystem restoration?
So yeah, thank you for the questions. So my idea is that by doing like an archaeological scouting of how environmental policies have developed over the last decades, like from the second half of the 20th century to today, it seems very evident that they have been informed by an ideological view of how we see ourselves in nature and our relationship with the natural world. And we have mainly approached it with an instrumental perspective. So, for example, the ecosystem services approach is very economistic and instrumentalistic. So the idea of a mindset shift is not the idea of wanting to change everything, but being aware that there are some ideological underpinnings going on, being aware of that, and understanding that that is not the necessary way of understanding ourselves in nature, but they are the result of an historical process, actually coming from a very small part of the world in a very definite part of the human history, which is like the Western modern culture, which also led to colonization, several problems of social justice aside from environmental justice. And so trying to challenge that view, or at least focusing on the fact that there are some other views and bringing that to policymakers can be really useful. Not only in my opinion, but in the opinions of scholars that work on relational environmental ethics, it can be useful for informing different policies that are more inclusive, both in terms of non-human nature and in terms of social justice. As for examples, I do not have examples on the ground, but the idea is that, for example, as some speakers have told us before my presentation, involving, for example, local communities is fundamental, not only for being able to know the ground, for involving people that are actually in the degraded lands, but also for understanding that different ontologies, different ways of understanding our relationship with the natural environment can be considered as valid and can be used not as some traditional legacy, but as something that can tell us more for designing really a truly sustainable future.
That's really good. So I'd like to open the floor for the discussion. Can anyone just unmute yourself or put your questions in the chat? I'm happy to ask on your behalf. All right, if there is no one, so I'd like to put one more question. So what challenges do policymakers face when trying to implement these ethical framework?
The challenges are many. First of all, it's not using policymakers are not used to engage with ethical or in general theoretical frameworks. And that is what, for example, IPBS is trying to do by being more inclusive in the people, the scholars that are involved in the discussions with policymakers. From the European perspective, I have, for example, there is an entire part of the European Environment Agency, which is involving philosophers. And this is maybe counterintuitive, but philosophers are trying to put themselves out to, for example, the European Commission and starting conversation about challenging the way we are used to talk about nature and to design policies for nature, because we have seen that the vision we have now is not really working, and so trying to challenge that and to provide alternatives can be useful. On the other hand, policymakers are challenged with very practical things. They have to deal with different stakeholders, a very complex system. And so the proposal we as philosophers are doing to have new ontologies introduced into the conversation is a long journey. But still, there are two plans of the conversation, two layers of the conversation. The practical one, we have to act very swiftly for 2030 and 2050 objectives. And there we can't really make the ontological changes. But on the long term, on the educational side, we can really change the mindset, especially for young people, or the generation restoration the Green Institute is talking about.
Good. So yeah, there's one question in the chat box. How can we work to foster a more relational understanding of the natural world?
That's good. Thank you for the question. So the idea is that I am very convinced that the educational part is very important, and so talking about, for example, when teaching economic principles, dealing with the ideological underpinnings of that, and not talking about that as a science, as something that's always been there, always been like this, but emphasizing the fact that there are some historical processes going on and ideas that have underpinned what is being said now, and how have we come to the current environmental crisis is important in order to understand the process we have created and how we can change paths. And relational environmental ethics can be a useful method in order to understand that we have several alternatives that can be explored.
All right. Okay. So there's another question. So from Arzenia Flock Victoria. So could you provide a practical example of how relational environmental ethics have been applied in a community or policymaking context?
Mm-hmm. There are several examples of the involvement of indigenous communities in environmental protection policies. And in those cases, when, for example, in South America, when policymakers act hand in hand with indigenous communities, you see that really the biodiversity protection is very much more effective because they have this relational approach to the environment very entrenched in our way of thinking. It's like having a different pair of glasses. It's like wearing a different pair of glasses because you don't see yourself in nature as something that is part of nature. You don't see nature. They see, for example, in the animistic cultures, they see natural entities and natural ecosystems as like brothers and sisters. And that is very effective also for restoration policies. So I would say that indigenous communities in South America, for example, that is my knowledge, or in Canada, the Haida communities in Canada, they have done very great work working together with the federal government. That is the first example that comes to my mind.
And how do you see the relational environmental ethics evolving in the future?
First of all, I'd like to see it more and more common as a framework in environmental ethics policies. And I'd like to see it as a third horn, as I was saying, both in theoretical conversation and in policymaking conversations. So I'd like to see more IPBF reports, more discussions on the policy ground, and even not for philosophers only, but even for environmental scientists to engage with it, even for the more practical projects.
So there's one more question. So nature-based solutions are implemented by the local communities for climate resilience. Due to lack of ownership right of the land and the community land are taken over by the authorities for unplanned urbanization. Are there any regulatory frameworks to ensure protection of the land use plans of the lands of local communities for managing climate risks?
Yes, thank you, Wesley, for the question. I don't have an answer actually on a technical answer because I don't know. I'm not aware of plans for protecting the local communities. But you raise a very good point because one of the issues that relational environmental ethics talks about and deals with is the unity, the embeddedness of environmental and social justice. When we talk about the involvement of indigenous or local communities, there is obviously an issue of social justice going on, and for example, colonization and overexploitation of people has been going on hand in hand with overexploitation of resources over the past 100 years. So it is very important to challenge these two issues at the same time in an organized and complex way, comprehensive way.
So I think Happiness, she would like to ask question.
Thank you very much, Sofia, for the presentation. I actually enjoyed the presentation, but I have a question to ask. So my question is, what are some common misconceptions about relational environmental ethics that you would like to address? So So I needed to throw more light on that.
What are the misconceptions? Did I understand right?
Yeah, what are the common misconceptions about relational environmental ethics that you would like to address? So,
Okay, thank you. So I don't think there are many misconceptions because it's a very young discipline, young area of research. So it's not very widespread to date. But I'll think more about it and try to reply to you. Maybe one of the misconceptions is that it's something very marginal, something related to I don't know, like animistic religions or very marginal ideas of the nature world, and it can't be mainstreamed, while it can be understood as a complementary perspective that can be added as an additional layer to current discussions. Maybe this may be a misconception.
okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I really love your answer. So thank you very much. Okay.
All right. There is another question in the chat box. So from IOMID. So thank you for the presentation, Dr. Sofia. My question is, what ethical dilemmas can arise from a relational perspective on environmental issues?
Thank you for the question. So this is a tricky one because there are dilemmas that can arise from a relational perspective, and is when you address the complexity and you try to balance all the interests and needs of different stakeholders, they can be in contrast with each other. So it's very difficult to navigate this diversity. It's obviously important to recognize it, but at the same time, I think one of the issues that policymakers will have to address if they want to, take on with this relational perspective is how to effectively balance all the different interests that are at stake, and that, for example, in an instrumental perspective, are simply not taken into account. When you embrace complexity, you have to employ more complex instruments in order to tackle it effectively.
I think there are no more questions on the chat box on the floor. So if anyone would like to put your questions, still we have some time. Otherwise, all right, okay. So
Thank you very much.
All right, okay. So yeah, thank you, Sophia, for your very nice presentation and the very, really, really interesting discussion. So hands up.